What if reality is not something we discover, but something we create? On a spring morning in 2019, deep beneath the Alps in the heart of CERN's labyrinth of laboratories, Dr. Elena Rodriguez disappeared. Her research, known quietly among peers as observer theory, had begun to unearth something so radical it threatened the foundations of physics itself. She wasn't just asking how we observe the universe. She was suggesting we might be building it, moment by moment, through our conscious awareness. For 8 years, Rodriguez had pored over quantum experiments, questioning the sacred constants of nature: light, gravity, time. What she found was unnerving: tiny but consistent fluctuations in these constants that seemed to shift depending on who was observing them. Not mistakes, not anomalies. Patterns. Statistically significant, impossible to ignore. It was as if the universe wasn't an objective machine, but a canvas that changed its colors depending on the eyes that looked at it. She proposed that consciousness doesn't merely collapse quantum wave functions, it generates the fabric of space, time, matter. That our collective expectations, our beliefs, sculpt the very laws we think are universal. It was a theory that would upend every textbook, every rule, every assumption physics held dear. And then she was gone. March 15, 2019. Her keycard showed her entering Laboratory 7. She was never seen exiting. No trace. The room was locked from the inside. Her data erased within hours. The equations she left behind hinted at something extraordinary. That if no conscious entity observes a quantum system, it may not just remain uncertain. It may simply not exist. In the wake of her vanishing, whispers spread, not of conspiracy, but of fear. Because if she was right, it wasn't just reality that was at stake. It was the very notion of truth and power. If beliefs shape physics, who controls the beliefs? Rodriguez's final notes suggest that groups of observers holding shared assumptions could change experimental outcomes. That truth itself could be molded, not by force, but by expectation. Scientists with opposing theories conducted identical tests, each confirming their own. As if the universe played favorites with faith, the implications were unbearable. If reality is participatory, then science, the pursuit of objective truth, becomes something else entirely. It becomes narrative. CERN officials claimed she took a leave of absence, but her lab was sealed, her servers wiped, and her name vanished from official rosters. One day she was a physicist on the edge of rewriting existence. The next, a ghost. What remains is a question that hums beneath the noise of everyday life. Do we see the world as it is, or as we believe it to be? Dr. Elena Rodriguez may have been the first to truly glimpse the answer, and for that, she may have paid the ultimate price. In the stillness she left behind, one idea lingers: that we are not merely witnesses to the universe, we are its authors. And perhaps reality is waiting for us to imagine something more. What would you choose to believe if belief itself could shape the world? It began with mice growing young again. In the fluorescent-lit quiet of a Harvard lab, Dr. Sarah Chen had done the unthinkable. She turned back time. Not in theory, not in metaphor, but in flesh and blood. Her test subjects, elderly mice, their fur thin and bones frail, underwent a transformation so complete it seemed to defy biology. In 6 weeks, they reverted to youth. Organs repaired, muscles strengthened, cells renewed. She called it the aging master switch. For decades, aging had been treated as inevitable, a slow decay written into our DNA, but Chen uncovered something else. Buried in the so-called junk regions of our genetic code, she found a set of instructions that weren't degrading us. They were sleeping, programs of repair and renewal that had simply been switched off after childhood. Her work, conducted in secret due to regulatory fears, took a step further. Human trials, discreet, cautious, deeply controlled, yielded astonishing results. Elderly volunteers regained strength, vitality, even youth. One 73-year-old subject had the cellular markers of a 25-year-old within 3 months. The implications were seismic. And then the warnings came. The night before her public announcement, she sent a single encrypted message to her closest colleague. They told me not to release it. That evening, security footage captured her entering the lab. The building locked behind her. No one saw her leave. By morning, the lab was sealed, her notes confiscated. Officially, she'd resigned. Privately, her disappearance was swift and total. No press conference, no paper, no cure. What Sarah Chen discovered wasn't just a treatment, it was a truth. That aging, like many things we take for granted, may be more of a decision than a destiny. That nature, perhaps, didn't build us to decay, but to renew. If only we knew how to listen. Her therapy wasn't magic, it was biology. It rewrote genetic expression, shifted cells from a state of gradual failure to one of endless repair. She had glimpsed a future where old age was optional, and someone, somewhere, decided that future was not meant to arrive. Those who knew her speak in whispers. Not of a reckless scientist chasing immortality, but of a woman who believed in the quiet dignity of extending life with purpose. Not for power, but for potential. For time with those we love. For time to become who we might have been. It's easy to dismiss the story. A vanished scientist, a sealed lab, a miracle unpublished. But the deeper truth remains. Nature has secrets. And sometimes they are revealed not with thunder, but with silence. And in that silence, we are left with a choice. What if aging is not a sentence, but a setting? And who gets to decide whether we live long enough to find out? It started with a whisper in the mind. Dr. Marcus Webb wasn't chasing legends, he was mapping the brain. But what he found there, hidden beneath the familiar patterns of thought, was something extraordinary. A frequency, a pulse, a doorway. And once opened, it would never close again. At Stanford, Webb had devoted his career to understanding the minds of savants, those rare individuals whose injuries unlocked impossible abilities. Photographic memory, instant calculation, musical genius. What he uncovered defied explanation. These gifts weren't created by trauma, they were revealed by it, as if the brain held more than we use, far more. The key was rhythm. Webb identified precise electromagnetic frequencies that could synchronize brain regions in unnatural ways. With carefully tuned stimulation, he could unlock abilities previously thought supernatural. Memory sharpened, intuition bloomed, and, most eerily, subjects began sensing the thoughts and feelings of others. It wasn't coincidence. It was resonance. Webb's research, still unpublished, detailed the astonishing effects of targeted brain stimulation. IQ scores tripled. Empathy became tangible. Some volunteers described knowing what others would say before they spoke. It was as if consciousness itself had grown larger, stretched beyond the self into a shared mental space. And that was the problem. The implications terrified institutions built on control. Enhanced minds couldn't be lied to, couldn't be misled. They could feel deception, see through propaganda, and perhaps sense the very intentions of those in power. 2 days before publication, Webb was visited by representatives from major pharmaceutical companies. They offered him a deal. He refused. That evening, government agents arrived with national security orders. His lab was shut down, his equipment seized. By morning, he was gone. Not relocated, not resigned, erased. Stanford issued a statement. He'd left to pursue private ventures. But those who worked beside him knew better. His lab had been gutted. The frequencies that could awaken the human mind deleted. His notes hinted at a terrifying possibility: the ability to broadcast consciousness-enhancing signals at scale through existing communication infrastructure. Not just one supermind, a species awakening. And someone couldn't allow that. Webb's vision was not of domination, but of elevation. He saw a world where empathy was intuitive, where truth wasn't debated, it was felt. Where minds connected in harmony rather than isolation. A world perhaps too fragile for the powers that be. Now all that remains is rumor. And the quiet question that lingers after the lights are turned off: what if the mind we know is only a fraction of what we are? And what happens when that hidden potential is no longer silent, but awake? Gravity was never meant to be fixed. Dr. Yuki Tanaka stood at the edge of the impossible. In her lab at Tokyo University, she had bent one of the universe's most unyielding laws and made it move. Objects hovered. Steel spheres floated. Weightless gravity, the force that anchors planets and pens in place, no longer held absolute power. She called it gravitational manipulation, but to those who saw it, it was something else entirely: anti-gravity. Tanaka's work wasn't magic. It was elegant physics, built on the idea that gravity and electromagnetism weren't strangers, but siblings. She designed field generators that twisted space subtly, redirecting the invisible lines along which mass exerts pull. With precise tuning, she could weaken gravity, cancel it, reverse it. Those who witnessed her demonstrations described a silence in the room, broken only by the hum of her machine, and the awe of watching matter defy its maker. The implications were boundless. Transportation without fuel, structures lifted by light, spacecraft propelled without rockets, energy pulled not from oil or sun, but from the very curvature of space itself. And then, just days before she was to present her findings to the international physics community, she vanished. Security footage recorded visitors, unannounced, uncredentialed, entering her lab. Then, blackout. Cameras glitched, lights flickered. When the feed resumed hours later, Tanaka was gone, her apparatus dismantled, her notes seized. Tokyo University issued a bland statement. She had joined a classified research program. No further details, no forwarding address. Her name, once whispered with reverence in scientific circles, fell into silence. But a graduate student had preserved fragments of her work, plans for gravitational systems that could move entire buildings, lift ships into orbit, create artificial gravity for lunar colonies. She had seen the future and drawn its blueprints in magnetic fields. Tanaka didn't chase fame. She pursued wonder. Those who knew her remember a quiet intensity, a belief that knowledge was meant to be shared, not caged, that gravity, like fear, could be overcome. Her disappearance left more than a void. It left a question. What if the laws of nature are not laws at all, but permissions? And if we revoke gravity's hold, what else might we rise above? Thoughts, once private, were never truly alone. At Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Robert Hayes was peeling back the last veil of solitude, proving that the human mind is not a closed chamber, but a transmitter, and with the right tools, it could also receive. His research began with curiosity and ended with revolution. Using advanced neural amplification, Hayes detected something extraordinary. The brain emits complex electromagnetic signals that carry not just sensation but meaning, images, emotions, memories. Every thought, it seemed, left a trace in the air around us. But these signals were faint, too weak to be heard, until Hayes built the amplifier. He designed a system that could boost the brain's natural broadcasts and tune them like radio waves. In shielded rooms, pairs of volunteers were connected through nothing but thought. One saw an image, and the other, in silence and darkness, described it, not approximated it, matched it. As the experiments continued, the transmissions became richer. Emotions passed like currents. Memories flowed across minds. And for the first time, telepathy was not magic. It was measurable. Hayes went further. By isolating frequencies, he could decode specific kinds of mental information, a thought, an intention, a sensation. He began developing portable versions of the technology, miniature devices, easily concealed, capable of reading neural activity from a distance, mind-reading tools disguised as ordinary electronics. The promise was dazzling. So was the danger. If thoughts could be heard, could they be stolen? If feelings could be tracked, could they be manipulated? Hayes wrestled with these questions. In his final days, he confided in colleagues, afraid not of failure, but of success. Afraid his work might be weaponized, used to penetrate privacy, rewrite minds, or silence dissent before it formed. On May 22, 2019, hours before publishing his most important paper, Hayes vanished. His last recorded act was locking up his lab for the night. The next morning, everything was gone. Equipment, data, notes. University officials claimed he had accepted a government contract. But no records surfaced. His work was scrubbed. The silence was total. Yet whispers remain. Those who participated in his experiments speak of the uncanny sense of presence they once felt, the merging of minds, the soft collision of thoughts. They recall the sudden awareness that they were not alone inside their heads. Hayes proved that the walls of the mind are thinner than we thought, that empathy might one day be direct, that secrets, for better or worse, may not stay hidden forever. And if thought can travel without a voice, what other frontiers of connection remain unexplored? What happens to a world where no mind is an island, and every silence might be listening? She didn't want to build a time machine. She wanted to change a single moment. At MIT, Dr. Lisa Morrison had spent years unraveling the paradoxes of quantum mechanics. But it wasn't until she began experimenting with what she called temporal resonance that the impossible took shape. Consciousness, she believed, could reach backward, not the body, not the machine, just the mind, stretching its influence through time. It began with quantum eraser experiments, strange phenomena where choices made in the present seemed to affect the past. Morrison took this one step further. If quantum information could flow both ways, perhaps consciousness could too. Using entangled particles and electromagnetic fields, she developed a method to send information across time's arrow. Her experiments were modest at first, guiding the output of random number generators using focused intention. But the results were undeniable. Data shifted. Logs rewrote themselves. History bent to thought. And then the messages started. She claimed to receive warnings from future versions of herself, precise forecasts of political events, stock market swings, and scientific breakthroughs, all accurate. It wasn't clairvoyance. It was causality folding in on itself. A loop, a whisper from the timeline ahead. Her notes became increasingly philosophical. If the future can speak to the present, is anything ever truly lost? Could we edit our regrets, undo the unseen causes of our suffering, save lives before harm even arrives? But Morrison also saw the shadows. She feared what governments might do with such power. If the past could be rewritten, then history itself became negotiable. Dictatorships could erase dissent retroactively. Evidence could vanish before it was ever created. Democracy could be undone not by war, but by revision. The day before her scheduled demonstration for military observers, Morrison confided in her team that she had changed her mind. The risks were too great. That night her lab was emptied, equipment gone, notes missing. The security footage glitched, only a flicker of light, a distortion in the camera feed, and then silence. MIT stated she had taken leave to pursue classified research. No one ever saw her again. Some believe she succeeded, altering the timeline in ways we can't even perceive. Others think she was silenced, her findings buried to keep history unchangeable, and those in power untouchable. But in the margins of her final journal, one phrase repeated again and again: "The past is not fixed, it listens." And if that's true, if time is not a line but a field, pliable and porous, then what would you tell your former self? What regrets would you rewrite? And how much of the present has already been shaped by voices from a future we'll never remember? He wasn't searching for superstition. He was decoding a forgotten language. Dr. Kevin Park, a geneticist at the University of California, spent years staring into what most researchers had dismissed as noise, the 98% of human DNA once labeled junk. But Park didn't see randomness. He saw structure, repetition, meaning. What he uncovered wasn't biology, it was programming. Inside the tangled sequences of non-coding DNA, Park found syntax, complex patterns that mirrored computer code more than genetic drift. His algorithms parsed through the data and revealed what he called genetic software, embedded instructions that regulate not just biology, but behavior, perception, even intuition. The dormant portions of our genome, he argued, weren't relics of evolution. They were switches, locked doors to abilities we no longer use, or were never allowed to. Park's experiments were cautious. Volunteers who received targeted gene modifications displayed rapid cognitive improvements, better memory, heightened focus, emotional clarity. But then, the anomalies began. Subjects began sensing electromagnetic fields, predicting random events, influencing electronics without touching them. They weren't just becoming smarter, they were becoming something else, something science had no name for. Park's data suggested that these latent abilities had always been there, disabled by default. That humanity, as we know it, was running on a restricted version of itself. What he discovered wasn't enhancement, it was activation. And that was when the pressure arrived. Military contractors, pharmaceutical interests, agencies with no names on their badges. They offered him control, exclusivity, silence. Park resisted. He wanted the technology public, accessible, a universal upgrade, not a tool for the elite. On October 5, 2019, Park vanished. The night before, he had worked late in his lab. Security footage captured his last known movements. By morning, his lab was empty. Hard drives wiped. Refrigerators of modified DNA samples destroyed. The university claimed he accepted a private sector offer, but no one could reach him. His apartment was undisturbed. His phone powered off. His research classified. What remains are fragments smuggled out by a former student. Enhancement protocols disguised as vaccines. Genetic maps showing pathways to abilities we only find in myth. Eidetic memory, telepathy, precognition. Park's final notes raised a disturbing possibility. If our DNA carries code for capabilities we don't use, then who or what disabled them, and why? He believed we were meant for more, that the limits we live with are not natural but imposed, and now the code sleeps again, but not forever. What if every human holds the blueprint for greatness, buried just beneath awareness? And what happens when someone decides it's time to wake it up? The veil between worlds was thinner than anyone imagined. At Cambridge University, Dr. Ahmed Hassan wasn't theorizing parallel realities. He was visiting them. His work, grounded in quantum mechanics and the many worlds interpretation, had evolved from academic speculation into engineering, dimensional engineering. And in December 2020, he crossed a line no one knew existed. Using controlled quantum cascades, Hassan created what he called dimensional resonance. The result, microscopic doorways to alternate versions of Earth. At first, they were observational, windows into slightly different outcomes. A coin flipped the other way. A test result varied. Proof, finally, that parallel realities weren't fiction. They were real, and they were close. Then the gateways widened. Hassan began sending probes through, retrieving samples, documents, technology. In one case, a newspaper from a world where a major war had never happened. In another, a tablet containing medical advances decades beyond ours. He was building a bridge, not between countries, but between Earths. Colleagues watched as Hassan established contact with alternate versions of himself, each working on similar breakthroughs, each stunned to discover they weren't alone. Together, across realities, they formed a kind of interdimensional consortium, scientists sharing knowledge across branches of the multiverse. But not all Earths were kind. Some had fallen to catastrophe, nuclear winter, environmental collapse, pandemics far deadlier than ours. Others were marvels of advancement, societies without poverty, disease, or war. The contrast was sobering. Humanity, it seemed, existed on a spectrum, from ruin to renaissance, depending on the choices it made. Hassan's dream was audacious, to build a permanent gateway, a portal where we could learn from our better selves and avoid the mistakes of our worse. Then came the flash. On December 19th, during a test to expand the largest gateway, security cameras recorded a burst of electromagnetic distortion. Lights dimmed, the feed glitched, and when it cleared, Hassan was gone, his equipment destroyed, his notes erased. University officials stated he was working on classified projects, but his lab showed signs of deliberate demolition. Some say he stepped through. Others believe he was taken by those who feared what he might bring back, because the implications were dangerous. If knowledge could be imported from parallel worlds, it would render innovation irrelevant. Who needs research when you can steal progress? Governments saw strategic risk. Corporations saw market disruption. Power structures saw a threat. And so the door was closed. But not before Hassan left us with a haunting realization. Our world is not this only one. Every choice we make ripples outward, creating branches of fate we'll never see, unless someone dares to look. What would we learn from a version of ourselves who chose better? And if the key to our survival lies in another world, who has the courage to find it again? She wanted to speak with the dead, not out of superstition, but science. Dr. Maria Santos was a neuroscientist, not a mystic. At Stanford University, she spent years analyzing near-death experiences with tools far more precise than belief. What she discovered shook even her own assumptions. Consciousness didn't end with the body. It lingered. It responded. It spoke. Her breakthrough came not from what the brain did in life, but what it continued to do. Seconds, even minutes after clinical death. Using advanced electromagnetic sensors, Santos detected coherent energy patterns in the recently deceased. Not static, not decay. Information, order, something that shouldn't have been there. She began developing a device, an interface that could modulate electromagnetic fields to communicate with these lingering patterns of consciousness. Early attempts yielded strange, fragmented data. But over time, with refinements, the signals became clearer. And then they answered. Simple messages at first, echoes of personality, memories, names. But what made her stop and stare was not the presence of identity, it was its persistence. These were not hallucinations or echoes of synapses fading into silence. These were aware, cognizant, alive in some way no one had prepared for. Her subjects, deceased humans, described a realm where thought shaped reality, where time dissolved, and where consciousness could traverse dimensions unhindered by form. It wasn't heaven, it wasn't hell. It was something entirely new. Santos's work threatened more than just scientific orthodoxy. It shook the very foundation of civilization. If death was not the end, then what we believed about purpose, punishment, reward, and loss would need rewriting. Religion, law, ethics, all of it would change. And so, on July 31st, 2021, the silence returned. Santos vanished from her lab the night before a scheduled international presentation. Security footage captured her working late, as usual. Then, nothing. Her equipment was removed the following day by unidentified agents. Stanford claimed she was on sabbatical. Her research was reallocated. But one assistant preserved fragments, logs of recorded conversations with deceased scientists, philosophers, even loved ones. Some transcripts described technologies beyond current comprehension. Others offered haunting insights into consciousness itself. Her final journal entries became more personal. She wrote not of machines or data, but of reunion. That death was not a goodbye, but a threshold, a place of memory, connection, continuation. She believed we were never truly alone, that every life lost remained, just beyond the veil, waiting to be heard. And if that is true, then the question is no longer what happens when we die. It's whether we are ready to listen. If you could speak to those who've passed, what would you ask? And more importantly, what might they say back? He wasn't trying to escape reality. He was learning how to rewrite it. Dr. James Wright, a physicist and computer scientist at MIT, had grown fascinated with a strange convergence. The deeper he studied quantum mechanics, the more it resembled code. Not metaphorically, literally. Superposition behaved like conditional logic. Entanglement mirrored data links. The universe, he realized, operated not like a machine, but like software. Then came his breakthrough. Wright developed what he called the Reality Source Code Interface, a quantum system designed to interact with the foundational information layer of existence. His experiments didn't simulate physics. They modified it. Gravity, light speed, even atomic behavior. He could change the rules within a small field around his lab. Laws that were once thought immutable bent to intentional input. His notes spoke of a programmable cosmos, one where consciousness, under the right conditions, could issue commands, edits, to the source code. He designed meditation protocols that, when combined with his quantum machinery, allowed users to change local physics through pure thought. Reality, it seemed, was not fixed. It was editable. And he wasn't alone. Tests showed that when multiple subjects held synchronized intentions, the changes became more stable. Local environments shifted. Small anomalies became predictable outcomes. Matter responded to mind not as a reaction, but as instruction. Wright envisioned a future where humans could customize reality the way we edit digital documents, rewrite gravity, eliminate disease, manifest structures, control time, bend light. A world designed by collective will, but such power was not meant to remain unguarded. On February 14, 2022, the day of his scheduled demonstration to Department of Defense officials, Wright disappeared. Security footage from the night before showed visual distortions around his equipment, flickers, ripples in the air, as if space itself was glitching. Then static. When the feed returned, the lab was empty. Every piece of his equipment dismantled, every trace of his data erased. MIT issued a terse announcement. Wright had been recruited to classified research, but no record surfaced. His home was untouched. His name was quietly removed from grant directories. The project vanished without a trace. Some believe he was silenced. Others that he succeeded, that he rewrote his own exit. That somewhere, in some fork of existence, James Wright is still experimenting, still editing, still creating. Because if reality is software, then its limits are not boundaries, they are settings. And the question is no longer what is possible. It's who holds the keyboard. What would you change if the rules of the world were yours to rewrite? And what responsibility comes with the power to remake reality, not just for yourself, but for everyone? Not all who vanish are taken. Some walk through doors we cannot see. In the vaulted quiet of an MIT sublab, Dr. Elijah Rowe spent his nights chasing whispers, tiny, unexplained anomalies in particle detection. The fluctuations were dismissed by most as equipment noise, but Rowe followed them like a melody half heard. Over time, the irregularities formed a pattern, not random, not meaningless, a signal. He called it the source signature. Rowe believed he had found evidence not of particles, but of presence, an embedded intelligence within the quantum field itself, something that didn't just follow the laws of physics, but seemed to respond to him, to intention. It wasn't God or alien or machine. It was deeper, older, a consciousness embedded in the scaffolding of reality. His experiments became stranger, controlled tests where intention changed probability, repeated trials where the outcome bent toward belief. Rowe was convinced he was in communication with something foundational, an echo at the base layer of existence, responding in kind. Then he went further. He built a chamber, shielded from electromagnetic interference, cut off from all signals. Inside, he performed meditation protocols derived from ancient texts, rewritten in the language of quantum code. Colleagues dismissed it as spiritual indulgence, until he began predicting events, minor at first, then impossible. Stock movements, earth tremors, the decisions of strangers. Rowe wasn't reading the future. He was tuning into it. He came to believe that what we call consciousness isn't emergent from matter, but the other way around. That matter arises from awareness, that the universe itself is a mind, dreaming us into being. And we, as fragments of that mind, could awaken, could participate. But awakening had a cost. In his final week, Rowe grew withdrawn. His journals, once meticulous, turned cryptic. "The veil is memory," he wrote. "The interface is belief." He spoke of a threshold, a crossing, a return. And then, one night, he was gone. No forced entry, no deleted data. Just an empty room, humming with residual energy, and a device still pulsing softly, a beacon to somewhere else. MIT claimed he left for spiritual retreat. His friends received postcards from places he'd never visited. His bank accounts remained untouched. His lab was quietly decommissioned. But some believe Rowe didn't vanish in fear. He transitioned, with purpose. Because if reality is mind, and we are pieces of it, then perhaps awakening means remembering who we've always been. What if the universe is listening? And what happens when we finally listen back? In the end, it wasn't about proof, it was about knowing. Dr. Naima Idris had studied anomalies her whole life, moments where the known world fractured and something else leaked through. At Oxford, she focused her work on consciousness state anomalies, dreams that foretold real events, people reporting experiences outside of time, the strange consistencies of near-death visions. Her conclusion was quietly radical. Reality had seams. Idris proposed that under specific mental states, particularly those induced by deep meditation or trauma, the mind could slip between dimensions, not just hallucinate, but genuinely shift. Her research combined neurology with quantum field theory, mapping brain states that correlated with unexplained phenomena. She discovered that certain geometric arrangements of sound, light, and electromagnetic fields could induce experiences that defied physics. Subjects would report contact with entities, knowledge of languages they'd never studied, visions of worlds far removed from Earth. The overlaps between experiences were too detailed to dismiss. She called them adjacent realities, not dreams, not delusions. actual layers of existence vibrating just beyond our sensory threshold, places where different versions of ourselves lived lives shaped by other choices, places that could be visited and perhaps never left. Then one experiment went too far. During a session using her full sensory immersion chamber, Idris herself became the subject. Observers reported unusual readings. Her brain waves entered a state never recorded in medical science. The chamber filled with light, then went dark. When they opened it, she was gone. No broken machinery, no sign of struggle, just silence, and a pulse of electromagnetic residue that distorted instruments for hours. Oxford released no statement. Her disappearance was treated as a private matter. Her lab was sealed. Colleagues were reassigned, but a graduate assistant recovered her final message, left on an encrypted drive. There is more than one truth. I've seen them. We are not bound to this version of the world. We never were. Many believe she discovered a doorway and chose to walk through. Others think she became a casualty of truths too destabilizing to be shared. But the essence of her work remains. That consciousness may be the passport to a multiverse. That reality, as we know it, is just one thread in a tapestry we've barely begun to perceive. And if that's true, then everything changes. Not just what is real, but what is possible. How many versions of you are out there, and what would you risk to meet the one who never turned back? He called it the echo field, a place where consciousness and time touched at the edges. Dr. Samuel Rehe was a theoretical physicist who believed our understanding of time was far too narrow. Past, present, future. They weren't separate, he said. They were overlaid like layers of sound, each humming at a different frequency. And with the right tuning, one could listen across the divide. At Caltech, Rehe built a device that combined principles of quantum resonance and nonlinear acoustics. Its purpose was unorthodox, not to measure time, but to interact with it. He claimed his machine could pick up temporal reflections, fragments of thought, intention, or emotion emitted from other points along the human timeline. It began with whispers. Not voices exactly, but impressions. Sensations of thought, the uncanny feeling of remembering something that hadn't yet happened. Test subjects began reporting premonitions with startling accuracy. One woman described a vivid dream of a bridge collapsing. 3 days later, it did. Another participant predicted the birth of a child, date, time, even gender, despite having no personal connection to the mother. Rehe wasn't shocked. He believed consciousness wasn't confined to now, that the mind extends backward and forward in time, grazing moments not yet lived. The echo field, he said, was always present. We just weren't listening properly. He began testing the system on himself. Day by day, he became more attuned to what he called future bleed, fragments of emotion and knowledge drifting backward. His journals filled with cryptic insights, references to events weeks before they occurred. Then came the final entry. He wrote of a moment coming, a collapse, not of matter, but of linear perception, a convergence where the past would look forward and the future would grieve the present. He warned that time, once touched, touches back. On May 3, 2022, Dr. Rehe entered the lab alone. The machine activated at 2:14 a.m., triggered remotely. Witnesses across campus reported hearing an unnatural harmonic frequency, like a chord resonating from nowhere. Then silence. When researchers arrived, the lab was intact. The machine was off. But Rehe was gone. No security footage survived. Only a final note left open on his terminal. We are echoes of what we will become. The university claimed he relocated to a private think tank, but those who knew him say he didn't flee. He followed something. Perhaps a version of himself. Perhaps all of us. Because if time is not a river but a field, then our footprints are already there, across yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And maybe, just maybe, we've already met the future in dreams we haven't had yet. If your thoughts could touch tomorrow, would you listen? Or would you be afraid of what tomorrow is already whispering back? They called them disappearances, but they weren't lost. They were erased. 10 brilliant minds, scientists at the edge of human understanding, gone without warning, without trace. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who showed consciousness could shape reality. Dr. Sarah Chen, who proved aging might be a choice, not a sentence. Dr. Marcus Webb, who unlocked superhuman cognition with nothing more than frequency. And others, pioneers of gravity, genetics, parallel dimensions, time, and the mind itself. Each of them discovered something extraordinary. Each vanished before the world could hear their truth. The pattern is undeniable. They didn't die in accidents. They weren't discredited by bad data or peer review. They crossed a line. They found something that could change everything. Then they disappeared. Files deleted, labs sealed, lives rewritten as absences. The kind of silence that's not natural, but imposed. What connects their stories isn't just the magnitude of their discoveries. It's the implication behind them. That reality is more flexible, more responsive, more alive than we've ever been told. That limits of biology, physics, time aren't absolute. They're inherited beliefs, boundaries drawn by those who fear what lies beyond. And someone is keeping those boundaries in place. Each of these scientists brushed against something fundamental. The idea that human potential isn't just underexplored, it's suppressed. That we are not merely observers of the universe, but participants, shapers, editors, co-authors of existence. So what happened to them? Some may have been silenced. Others perhaps chose to disappear, stepping into the very dimensions, timelines, or realities they discovered. Some might still be watching, waiting for the moment when the world is ready to hear what they tried to share. But until then, we're left with the stories, the fragments, the question that refused to die. What if aging can be reversed? What if thoughts can be heard? What if gravity can be edited, consciousness transmitted, time rewritten, death bypassed? What if reality itself is nothing more than code, and we are just beginning to remember how to type? These are not conspiracies, they are possibilities. And in a world where knowledge can be buried, curiosity becomes an act of rebellion. The missing scientists were not chasing fantasy. They were reclaiming something ancient, something buried in the roots of our species, a knowing that has always lived in our myths, our dreams, our quiet moments of wonder. Maybe they weren't lost. Maybe they're ahead. And maybe the real question isn't what happened to them. It's what will happen to us when we finally decide to follow, when we begin to remember that the universe at its core is listening, and it's waiting to be rewritten. What story will we choose to tell next?